really, the American Revolution has a lot to do with the West, and we need to remember that. We know the story, everybody knows the story of the American Revolution and the coming of the American Revolution that's centered in places like Boston and Philadelphia. The resentment over the sugar tax, the resentment over the stamp tax, all of the uprising and unrest in dramatic moments like the Boston Tea Party. We're very familiar with that story. Lesser known is how important the West, and the Ohio Valley in particular, was to the coming of the American Revolution. In 1763, when at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain took possession, at least on paper, of basically all of North America east of the Mississippi, they had a challenge there in how to govern all of that territory. And in order to minimize conflicts with indigenous people, native nations that occupied that great expanse of territory, they passed a piece of legislation in 1763 which essentially banned settlement in the territory west of the Appalachians for American colonists. Problem was that many colonists, and elite colonists in particular, many of them quite familiar characters, people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Patrick Henry, many of them were involved in land speculation companies where they had a real financial interest in acquiring that land and then selling it on to settlers. And so they resented this proclamation that banned not only settlement, but the purchase and sale of that land as well. Meanwhile, in those Western territories, of course, are indigenous nations for whom these territories are homelands. And they intend for those territories to remain homelands. So they have a very strong stake in these questions as well. All of this is to say that as much as the American Revolution, the coming of the American Revolution is a story about abstract principles like liberty and independence, it's also a question about land and who's going to control this massive territory in the American West. Oftentimes we forget that, oftentimes we ignore it, and we sometimes ignore it because what's going on in the West at this time seems sort of sleepy, it seems kind of inconsequential, and the characters are unfamiliar, right? The French colonists and the Indians that are the inhabitants of the Illinois country and the West, they don't usually make it into the cast of characters that we recognize as the agents of the American Revolution, but they were no less consequential in terms of bringing it about, and the American Revolution was no less consequential for them. It was truly a revolutionary experience for these people out here on the frontier during the Revolutionary years. So George Rogers Clark, a Virginian who in 1778 is appointed by Virginia officials to lead this campaign. He's an ambitious, kind of a military strategist and thinker who believes that the American Revolution will not be complete unless it's carried all the way to the Mississippi River, and he wants to do that himself, so he leads this army of roughly 175 people down the Ohio River. In 1778, they arrive at the town of Kaskaskia, which they take control of without firing a shot, and then later take control of Cahokia, another French settlement there in the Illinois country. In the winter of 1779, they go and they take possession of Vincennes, Indiana, a French outpost. All of these areas were at that time under the control of Britain. Clark helps us understand the extent to which the American Revolution was indeed a fight for control of land. We think of it as a fight for independence from colonial authority. In its way, it was also a fight for colonial authority, and Clark was kind of a colonial agent in a certain way of thinking. His arrival again, was a watershed moment because it meant that at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain ceded all of the territory that it had claimed in the Trans-Appalachian West to the Americans. Again, left out of that treaty, and oftentimes left out of this heroic story of George Rogers Clark, is the fact that this land, of course, is the homeland of many indigenous nations who were not consulted in 1783 at the Treaty of Paris, and who still, of course, claimed sovereignty in that territory. And it was Clark's arrival that inspired many of those indigenous nations to cooperate together to begin to resist the arrival of the Americans. Clark's importance lasts much beyond the American Revolution because it sets the stage, right, for these later conflicts that the United States will engage with the indigenous people of the Midwest.